The following program, General Grant and, is a presentation of the Civil War Broadcasting Network, one of those programs wherein General Grant reflects on someone of note in his life. It's available on the free YouTube channel, General Grant by himself or Dr. E.C. Fields, and on the Facebook page, Kurt Fields as General Ulysses S. Grant, and other social media. Permission to copy and distribute is granted and indeed encouraged. Remember, you are the future of our past. And now, General Grant and General James Longstreet. Welcome to the library with me here this evening, and I'm General of the Army's Ulysses S. Grant. You join me here in my library. Tonight I'm going to reflect on James Longstreet and my relationship with him that lasted all my life. Now, Pete Longstreet, and he got the nickname Pete from his father, but I shall elaborate on that in a moment. He was born on January the 8th in 1821, and his father was of Dutch descent and background. His mother was of English, British background, and there was some wealth there in the family. They had a plantation south of Edgefield, South Carolina, where he was born and spent some of his early life. But he for the most part, grew up in Augusta, Georgia, where he had an uncle. And his father had decided that he wanted Pete or James to have a military education, and he wasn't going to get that education there in the Edgefield, the South Carolina area where he was living. So he sent him to his brother, and for 8 years, Pete went to school there, and when he was eligible or of age to go to the United States Military Academy, he got an appointment there that involved his mother having moved to Alabama. His father had died. Mother moved to Alabama, and Henry Clay actually had a hand in getting James Longstreet appointed to the United States Military Academy. And he entered there for the class of 1842. He was a year ahead of myself. His nickname, though, was Pete, because he grew to be 6 feet 2 inches tall, weighed well over 200 pounds, about 220, I think, is what he would admit to me. And being so solid at such a young age, his father called him Pete after St. Peter, upon which Christ was going to build his church, the Rock. So with his rock-like appearance and his father's biblical background, he named him Peter or Pete as a nickname. Well, James went into the academy and was not a good student. In fact, he graduated 54th out of 56 in the class of 42. And I don't think he ever got above the bottom third in anything that he took in the academy. Now, he was all in for the physical activities and the military activities, but his studies, he was weak there. But he did manage to graduate by the hardest, 54 out of 56 in the class of 42. And when I got there in 39, he was going into his second year. And we hit it off quickly and well, and for the next 3 years became the best of friends. When he graduated in 42, he went on to Jefferson Barracks. He was assigned there with the 4th Infantry. So he was there a year before I was. I got there in August of 43. He was well established. In fact, he was squiring around Captain Garland's daughter, Louise Garland, who was a beauty and the daughter of the commandant. So I began to go out to Whitehaven, and for the next few months I was there visiting with the Dent family and Fred Dent, one of my roommates, family, and then I met Julia in February of '44, and we began what I later realized was courting. But Pete and I were sent to Mexico, first down to Corpus Christi, the Camp Salubrity in Louisiana first. We were the Army of Observation. And then they moved us to Corpus Christi, Texas, and we were there for several months. And while we were there, Pete was involved in building the theater. And we put on plays for the entertainment of the officers and the troops. One of them was Othello, and something that gave me some heartburn for a while was in casting it, since we had no women, for the role of Desdemona, Othello's love interest, they cast me, Pete cast me as Desdemona. Fortunately, that agony lasted but a little while, because the fellow who was playing Othello, after some rehearsals, complained that I wasn't motivating him for the tenderness that he needed for the role. It just wasn't working. The chemistry was not working. So we wound up hiring an actress, professional actress from New Orleans, who came in and did that, and I was relieved of that burden of playing Desdemona. But we ultimately got into the war in '46, and Pete was in nearly every battle in the war. He was there at Palo Alto and Resaca de la Palma, the first two battles of the war, with me, and we fought throughout the war. He was then with the 8th Infantry Regiment, and actually when we were going into Chapultepec, into Mexico City, he was wounded pretty severely in the thigh. And by the time the war was over, not long after it, he had been breveted, I believe 3 times for bravery, breveted up to captain. And because of his wound, he didn't get to go home until December of '48. But he went home promptly, as soon as he could, married Ms. Garland, and they equally as promptly began having a family. They ultimately had 10 children. Well, he attended my wedding in August of 1848, August the 22nd. And I'd like to clear up, if I could, a long-standing myth. He was not my best man. He really wasn't even a groomsman. We didn't have best men and groomsmen for weddings in those days. He merely stood up with me. But he was there. He did stand up, and I was glad to have him there. And he's also related, I think, by marriage to my wife, Julia. I think he's her 4th cousin by marriage through somebody else. And beyond that, I get lost in the genealogy. He went on, he stayed in the Army, and was actually, when the war started, he was fighting Indians. He'd made major. And when Sumter was fired on, he and several of his fellow Confederate officers, or officers who became Confederate, resigned and came back to Richmond. He was promptly given a Brigadier General commission by President Davis and entered the war. Well, his first real combat was at 7 Pines early in the war, where Joe Johnston was severely wounded. He didn't do well. And then at the Battle of 7 Days, not long afterward, under Lee's command, he did much better, distinguished himself, and ultimately became Lee's right-hand man. In fact, Lee wrote in his report he was the staff in my right hand for those battles, and ascended unto Lee's right hand and became what Lee referred to as his old war horse. He was distinguished in combat for the most part. When they got to Gettysburg, though, he had some difficulties with Lee about that, because it was his understanding, his preference, that they were going to fight a defensive war, and therefore, when they got into combat, to fight a defensive combat on campaign. Well, Lee is not a defensive commander, and when they went into the Pennsylvania countryside, Lee became very aggressive. And on the second day of Gettysburg, he was accused of being sluggish by some of his compadres, Jubal Early and A.P. Hill, as I recall, Daniel Harvey. And they said he didn't move with the alacrity he should have, and that negatively impacted what happened that day in combat. On the third day, when Lee wanted Pickett's charge ordered, Pete Longstreet did not want to do that. In fact, and he argued with Lee not to do that. And Lee said, "We are going to do that. They are there, and I'm going to them." And I understand that when the order to be given, it was time, that he couldn't bring himself to get the order, that Pickett asked him, "What are my orders? Am I to move?" And Longstreet could only nod in assent, yes. And it turned out, unfortunately, it turned out just as Longstreet had feared it would turn out, and was a debacle. And Longstreet had that albatross hung around his neck later, after the war was over, but I will not digress at this time. After Gettysburg, he wanted to be transferred out of the Army of Northern Virginia and go to the Western Theater. He had his opportunity to go down and join Bragg at Chickamauga, and he requested to do so. Now, he moved, as I recall, 2 divisions, a division or several hundred cavalry, and 26 guns on trains from Virginia to northern Georgia, some 750 miles, over 16 different railroads, load, unload, 7, 8 times, and did it in less than 3 weeks. An entire army and artillery, 750 miles, 16 railroads, and did it in less than 3 weeks. It's one of the most remarkable feats of the war. I regret that it is not more well known. He got there in time to join in the Battle of Chickamauga, and is credited with winning the battle, because when one of his fellow officers opened a gap, one of the Federal officers opened a gap in their lines, Longstreet was in the right place at the right time and poured a division, I believe it was that size force, in between the Federals and set them on their heels to retreating. And it was the solid, rock-steady work of George Thomas, that saved the day. But after that, Longstreet and Bragg were at cross purposes. In fact, Longstreet was involved in a round robin letter that was sent to Jefferson Davis, asking that he come down or that he replace Braxton and Bragg in command. Nobody liked Bragg. And Davis himself came down there to Bragg's headquarters, and instead of of relieving Bragg or working out some kind of a compromise with his command staff, he summarily told his command staff, "This is the way it's going to be, and you'll like it." And then he entrained on the cars and went back to Richmond. Longstreet couldn't abide Bragg, and he asked Bragg to be detached. He wanted to go up to Knoxville, where I had sent Burnside. And Burnside is not under siege, but Burnside's pretty well stuck in the Knoxville area. And Longstreet marched his army out and went up to attack Burnside. And unfortunately for Longstreet at the Battle of Fort Sanders, it was a debacle. Longstreet did not do well in the really only independent command that he had in the war. He was badly beaten and went into winter quarters not far from Knoxville at, I think, Rogersville, Tennessee. And when the weather broke, he marched back north to Virginia just in time to join Lee at Petersburg. So he was at Petersburg for a good while, all the way through the evacuation and going to or leaving Richmond and heading toward what ultimately became Appomattox. And when we got to Appomattox, he said a couple of things at Appomattox that I think noteworthy. One was that the night of April 7th, when I sent General Lee my first note entreating him to surrender, Lee read it and showed it to Longstreet. Longstreet read it, and all he said was, "Not yet." And Lee acted on that with that encouragement, confirmation from Longstreet. When he was going to surrender, Lee was concerned about the terms he would get from me. And Longstreet said, "Grant is a generous man. He's a good man. He'll give you the best terms he can. He'll give you good terms. And if he doesn't, come back and we'll go at it again." So Lee surrendered to me. When I got to the courthouse, I'd left and come back the next day, I believe it was the next day on the 10th. When I had met with General Lee briefly, I went back to the McLean house, and I saw several officers, Confederate officers there, and one of them was Longstreet. And I almost jumped off my horse. I was so overjoyed to see him. Went over to him and hugged him, gave him a cigar, and I said, and he said, "Why is it that men who are destined to be brothers must fight?" And we all had a moment of throat lumps with that. And finally we regained control of ourselves, and it passed. And I invited him to a card game. I said, "Let's play a game of whist and talk about the old times in the old Army before the war." Longstreet remarked about it later. He said, "It's like nothing had ever happened between us. We picked up there on the grounds of the McLean house at Appomattox after the surrender, just as we were the last time we saw each other in St. Louis." Well, after the war was over, in '68, Longstreet had reached out to me to get a pardon. He went to President Johnson to get a pardon first, and President Johnson was handing out pardons like candy to children, but he told Longstreet, he said, "You are one of three people who I will not give a pardon: Jeff Davis, Robert E. Lee, and you." After that, Longstreet came to me and talked with me, and I prevailed upon the president to pardon Pete, and in '68 he was indeed pardoned. He early on came out in support of the Republican Party, and that was the beginning of his plummeting in respect and consideration by the Confederate leadership and much of the common man. He early said we should support Reconstruction, we should support the Republican Party. Indeed, he was a heavy supporter of myself for my race in '68, and one of my managers of sorts to help me get elected. And because of that, I appointed him the customs collector at New Orleans. He moved to New Orleans, and when he was down there, he was appointed a major general in the militia, and he got into some difficulty there because the White League was rumbling and rising in power, and there were some riots out of New Orleans, and then in New Orleans there was a riot I think it was at the Freedom Hall, but it was a white league and against the New Orleans police and city of New Orleans militia, and it was quite a riot. Longstreet was mobbed, pulled off his horse, he was shot, spent bullet hit him, and after that he thought, he waited a while, but not very long, he decided to move out. He was ultimately appointed the ambassador to the Ottoman Empire in Europe, and he was there for, I think, almost 2 years. Then he was appointed commissioner of railroads, and he was a U.S. Marshal in northern Georgia. He was the commissioner of railroads through a couple of presidents, and then he was appointed, his last public job was U.S. Marshal for northern Georgia, and then Garfield came into office, and Garfield being a Democrat, that was the end of it for Pete and his being a marshal. And he settled down there in Georgia, Gainesville. He'd moved to Gainesville, Georgia, and wrote his book From Manassas to Appomattox. And in 1889, April the 9th of 1889, the 35th anniversary of the surrender, his house burned to the ground. And then his wife died, I think in December of '89. And I'd like to point out, I remember now, in December of '62, 3 of his children, a 1-year-old, a 4-year-old, and an 11-year-old, all died within a week or so. 2 died, one after the other, one day, next day. The 3rd died just a few days later. So he had suffered the loss of 3 children from scarlet fever. An epidemic had hit Richmond, and he lost his 3 children. And then in December of '89, he lost his wife of 42 years. He wrote his book and maintained his farming and his interest there in Gainesville, Georgia. So that's James Longstreet, one of the best friends I ever had. A good friend from when I met him as an entering first-year man at the academy in 1843, right through Appomattox, and helping to get him a pardon in '68, appointing him to some public service jobs where he fared well in supporting his family, and was a good man, a good friend to me all my life. So that is, at this point, I think I've said all I need to say about James Longstreet and myself, Pete Longstreet, and I'll bring my remarks to a close. Thank you for joining me. You humble me with your presence and your interest, and I look forward to spending time with you in the near future when we meet again in the library. But until then, this is General Grant, General of the Armies, bidding you a fond farewell.